Welcome to Biology 101. Today we'll be starting with a basic introduction to biology itself. We'll cover three major topics: what is biology, the five unifying themes, and the process of science, although we'll discuss the process of science in our lecture. Biology itself is pretty straightforward, at least on the surface. The prefix bio means life, and the suffix ology means the study of. So biology is the study of life. But it's also the study of living organisms and how they interact with their environment. And if we're going to study life, we have to first define what life is. And that's actually pretty difficult. There's no real consensus, even among biologists, on what it means to be alive. If you really want to get under their skin, try asking them if they think a virus is alive. And based on some of the things we're going to talk about today, some might say yes, and others might say no. And that's because what we usually use to define life has to do with consistent features based on what something has or does. So what things do all living things, as defined by biology, have in common? The first thing is that all living things are made up of cells. That's something that we're going to be building on a lot as the semester progresses. We'll start by talking about how proteins and molecules are made and how those things work together to form the cell, and how cells later work together to form larger organisms. They also all change over time, and this is usually in the process of growth, development, and reproduction. So we might have our frog go from an egg to a tadpole to a froglet to a frog over and over and over again. And this change, growth, and development is controlled by DNA. Living organisms also have to have the ability to capture and use energy. If you're a plant, that means that you must be able to get energy from the sun. And if you're an animal, it usually means that you get energy from eating food. Living organisms must also be able to respond to external environments and regulate their own internal environment. When we think of plants, we often don't think that they have the ability to respond to the external environment, but they often do. If you've ever watched a sunflower, for example, its flower will turn to face the sun as the sun moves across the sky. This requires the flower to be able to determine where light is coming from and modify its body accordingly. So even though plants don't seem like they respond very much, they really do. And the last but not least thing is that groups of organisms that are alive change over time, and we usually refer to this as evolution. Biology is a very broad topic, and it's very difficult to talk about all of it all at once. Scientists often group things to make them easier to compare or understand. So to really understand living organisms, we need to do this too. And we call these different levels of organization. The levels of organization start at the atomic level. These are individual units of an element. Things like carbon, for example. Two or more of those atoms can eventually come together to create things like DNA or proteins. Those would be molecules, and we would call this the molecular level. Multiple molecules can come together to create structures, such as organelles. These structures perform specific tasks, and all of these organelles can come together to create a cell. This is the smallest unit of life that has all of the characteristics I mentioned before. Multiple cells can then come together to form tissues. These are groups of cells with common functions. Groups of tissues with common functions can band together to form an organ, like the brain. Multiple organs, like the brain and spinal cord, can work together to form an organ system, like the nervous system. And groups of organ systems can come together to form multicellular organisms, like this one ring-tailed lemur here. Multiple individuals of the same species are then considered a population. All of the species that occupy a single area would be a community, and all of those individuals in the community plus the physical environment that they live in would be considered the ecosystem. All of these different levels of organization are ways to think about the biological world and the life that we interact with. So now that we have a basic idea of what biology is, now we want to talk a little bit about the things that unify everything that we'll talk about this semester. And those major themes are going to be evolution, information, organization, energy and matter, and interactions. This is how your book lists them, and honestly, when they're listed this way, I'm not really sure how those are themes. I mean, organization, information, energy, those things are everywhere. How is that specific to biology? So let's go through and talk about them a little bit. So let's start with the most central theme, and that's evolution. So I've already talked a little bit about how life is distinguished by its unity. All life has made up of cells, we all have to be able to interact with our environments, all of those things. But it's also important to recognize that life is incredibly diverse. The scientific explanation for both this unity and diversity is evolution, the process of change that has essentially transformed life on Earth from its earliest forms to the vast array of organisms living today. So how can something explain both unity and diversity? It's actually pretty simple, so let's look at an example. In this image, we have 3 different animals. If I were to ask you what they are, you'd probably tell me that they are all birds. The American flamingo, the ruby-throated hummingbird, and the penguin are all easily recognizable as birds. And what about them makes that so? Well, it has to do with their unity. They all have feathers, they all have beaks, and they all have similar body plans. So their similarities make it very easy for us to tell they are all related. But they're also incredibly diverse. If we were to look at the way the wings on each of these birds work, we find that they are very different structures. Flamingos can fly, but they can't hover in space the way a hummingbird can, and penguins can't fly at all. Their beaks are also dramatically different, based on what they eat. So flamingos are filter feeders that filter small food and shrimps out of the water. Hummingbirds have long beaks which allow them to eat nectar, and penguins are fish eaters that have to hunt in the water. So how did all of this happen? The explanation for how you can have animals that are so similar and yet so different is natural selection and evolution. So what is the basic process? We can break down natural selection into 2 parts. Observations, those are things that we can see, and inferences, those are things that we can infer based on the evidence that we see. The 2 major observations for natural selection is that there are variations in nature, and that these variations are heritable. That means that they can be passed from one individual to their offspring. If you're not sure about there being heritable variations, just look at the members of your family. Everyone in your family looks different, but you all share very similar traits, and it's very clear where you get those traits from. The second observation is that there has to be an overproduction of offspring. What we mean by this is that not all offspring are able to make it to adulthood to have their own children. This means that there is going to be unequal reproduction. Some individuals are going to have advantages over others, and those individuals will have more offspring. This will eventually lead to an increase in the frequency of those traits in the population over time. This is evolution. So let's look at a simplified example. In this example, we're looking at beetles that live in a very dark environment, and these beetles have variation in the color of their shells. Some of these individuals are easier for predators to see. In this case, the bird is able to see light-colored beetles at a much higher rate than dark-colored beetles. This means that the light-colored beetles are more likely to be eaten. If you're eaten, then you won't be around to have offspring, so more dark-colored beetles will have more children. This will eventually lead to an increase in the frequency of dark-colored beetles and a decrease in the frequency of light-colored beetles in the population over time. Another central theme for evolution is that each species on Earth today has a family history. A species represents only one twig on a branching tree of life that extends back in time. We usually represent this in something we call a phylogeny. This is an example of a phylogeny that includes some animals between dogs, foxes, and wolves, and raccoons. The structure of a phylogenetic tree is relatively simple. It has branches and nodes. Branches denote individual species, and nodes represent the most recent common ancestor between those species. It's important to understand that common ancestors are not members of the species to which they branch. So, for example, the node between raccoons and weasels is an ancestor that was neither a raccoon nor a weasel, but eventually gave rise to both of these organisms through time. The importance of evolutionary theory to our everyday life cannot be overstated. It's essential to our use of medicine, conservation, and agriculture. In fact, all of the biomedical research that has led to a lot of breakthroughs for treating various human diseases rely on how related we are through evolution to organisms like mice and insects. We also take advantage of selective pressure through selective breeding and artificial selection to create crops and livestock that are particularly useful for human beings. The major difference between natural selection and artificial selection is that artificial selection is performed with a particular result in mind, and it has nothing to do with the fitness or survival of the individual being selected. If you don't believe me, you can think about designer animals. For example, pugs are extremely popular, but do you really think that a pug could survive in the wild? I'm pretty sure the answer is no. The reason that pugs exist is because we find really ugly things really cute, and we're willing to take care of them. So we're selecting for a trait that is actually a problem, and that's the difference between artificial and natural selection. These differences are particularly dramatic when it comes to agriculture. So for example, in the image here, you can see that natural corn was pretty small. People still ate it, there weren't that many varieties, and it primarily came from Central America. Over time, we've selected for sweeter, larger, and easier to eat corn. And now, it's huge! Corn's everywhere. There are more than 200 varieties, and we can grow it across the globe. It bears little resemblance to that old grain that it used to be. The same thing is true for a lot of other vegetables. For example, all of these vegetables, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, and cauliflower, are descendants from a single plant, the Brassica oleracea. Each of them was specifically selected for the part of the plant that that group of individuals liked to eat, whether that was buds, stems, leaves, flowers, or larger flower clusters. The downside to this relationship, though, is that the cabbage worm, which is a big pest for cabbages, also is attracted to all of these other plants. So if you have cabbage infestation, you have to watch out for your broccoli and your kale, too. The next major theme centers around the idea that life depends on the flow of information. That means that not only do you need information, but you need to have a way to store and transmit it. This largely focuses on this idea that DNA is responsible for heredity and for programming the activities of a cell by providing the blueprints for proteins and other materials the cell will need. The DNA itself is made up of 2 strands of nucleotides, as indicated here, and we'll talk about how DNA works and what its structure is in detail later in the semester. The important thing about this flow of information is that DNA contains these blueprints in the form of genes. These genes are then transcribed into RNA, which carry the information, to cellular machinery that will then translate that information into proteins that the cell will use for a variety of functions. The flow of information is also important for responding to both external and internal environmental cues and stimuli. And these are important for regulating body processes and gene expression. One classic example is thinking about the insulin pathway. In order for your body to regulate its blood sugar, it has to be able to detect the amount of sugar that's present inside the bloodstream. So the signal here is that there's a high level of sugar or glucose in the blood. When that happens, the pancreas releases insulin. Insulin will then bind to stimulate body cells to take up glucose. This will remove sugar from the blood and lower the blood sugar level. If any part of this pathway, detection of high blood sugar, release of insulin, insulin's ability to bind, or the ability of cells to take up sugar are impaired, it can lead to a variety of different types of diabetes. The next theme centers around organization, and primarily the idea that structure and function are related. This relationship between structure and function can be observed at every level of life. At the molecular level, the structure of proteins correlate with their functions, and we'll discuss that pretty in depth when we talk about proteins in the macromolecule chapter. For example, proteins like hemoglobin molecules have pockets that are specifically made to transport oxygen, and the number of oxygen molecules that they can transport are obvious by the number of pockets that are present. On the cellular level, long extensions of specific cells like nerves enable them to transmit impulses from your spinal cord to your toes. So the structure of a molecule and the structure of a cell are directly related to the function that they perform. An interesting example in a complete organism is a false thumb. The purpose of a thumb is to provide something to grasp against, a counterpoint, if you will, so that you can hold a round or cylindrical object. This bone is positioned in the same kind of location that a thumb would be, although it is not a complete digit and is not able to bend. Based on its location and its overall structure, one might assume that it functions the same way as a normal thumb, and one would be correct. You can see the red panda in the picture is holding an object the same way you might, with the forefingers pushing the object against the false thumb. Another example is the sheer diversity of bills. We touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about evolution, how flamingos, hummingbirds, and penguins all have different bills because they eat different things. This is more obvious when looking at birds that are more similar. These birds are all members of the finch family and are part of Darwin's finches from the Galapagos. We'll talk about that more extensively when we discuss evolution in the next introductory video. But suffice it to say, the shape of these beaks are specifically related to the type of food that these birds eat, and therefore their structure is related to their function. The next major theme is that life depends on the transfer and transformation of both energy and matter. It's important to note that energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction. All energy enters ecosystems as sunlight. They are then converted to chemical energy by producers like plants and passed on to consumers when they are eaten, and eventually exit as heat. Unlike the linear flow of energy through the ecosystem, matter is cycled. This occurs because matter can neither be created nor destroyed, and it doesn't leave the ecosystem the way heat does. Matter is cycled in the ecosystem from the atmosphere in the soil, through producers, consumers, and decomposers, and then back into the environment. The last theme of life depends on interactions within and between systems. The study of life extends from the microscopic scale of the molecules and cells that make up an organism to the global scale of the living planet. At each level of organization, emergent properties can be observed. These are the result of interactions between the components of a system. Emergent properties are properties that arise through interactions between parts that do not have the property themselves. Let's think about this in the terms of being good at sports. In order to be good at sports, you have to have a lot of different qualities. Things like decision-making, game involvement, skill efficiency, techniques, work rate, and movement efficiency. All of these smaller parts are part of larger pieces. For example, decision-making and game involvement both work toward tactical performance. Skill efficiency and technique determine how good you are at technical skills, and your work rate and movement efficiency determine how in shape you are, and thus determine your physical performance. All three of these, tactical, technical, and physical performances, work together to determine your overall performance. This is part of why, as sports stars age, they stop performing in teams and instead become coaches. Their tactical and technical performance increases as their physical performance decreases. And that's just individual performance. When you put a person on a team, it adds a bunch of other things that have to be put together to see whether or not the team will be successful. This is why the all-star team usually isn't the best team. While each individual player has excellent performance, the emergent properties of the team that they create are pretty poor. What makes you great individually doesn't necessarily make you a good team player. Emergent properties in biology work the same way. Individual parts, like molecules, can come together to make organelles, organelles come together to create cells, and cells have emergent behaviors, which we would refer to as life. As you move up in organization, emergent properties change. Cells work together to form tissues, tissues work together to form organs, and organs work together to form organ systems. Using an approach called systems biology, scientists attempt to model the behavior of these biological systems by analyzing the interactions among their parts and drawing connections to the emergent properties that they observe. So now we have a better idea how these words really relate to major themes. Organization has to do with structure and function and how they are related, and also how different properties of life emerge at different organizational levels. Information refers to the way life depends on the flow of information, from DNA to RNA to protein, and also between systems. Energy and matter refers to how life depends on the transfer and the transformation of energy and matter through ecosystems. Interactions has to do with how interactions at organizational levels between systems result in emergent properties. and evolution is the core theme of biology, which helps to explain diversity and the unity of life.